The laughter inside the luxury Lagos banquet hall grew louder as Olumide raised a glass beside the beautiful model now wearing the wedding ring that once belonged to his sick wife. Cameras flashed, wealthy guests applauded. But near the ballroom entrance, Abibat stood trembling in the rain-soaked dress she had worn straight from the hospital. Her weak body could barely remain upright as security guards blocked her from coming closer. She should have stayed where sick people belong. Someone whispered. Abibat lowered her tearful eyes in silence. What nobody inside that glittering hall understood was that before this story ended, the same woman they mocked would become the reason Olumide cried real tears for the first time in his life. If you're watching right now, tell us your country and local time in the comments. And if you believe kindness and loyalty still matter in this world, subscribe to the channel and join our family. Long before sickness entered their home, Abibat Bello used to laugh so loudly that neighbors on Adoniran Street often stopped to smile when they passed her small apartment balcony in Lagos. She was the kind of woman who filled ordinary rooms with warmth. Even during the years when money was scarce, when electricity disappeared for days and rainwater leaked through the kitchen ceiling, Abibat still found reasons to dance while cooking rice over a small gas burner. She would pull her husband into the middle of the tiny living room and laugh when he pretended to complain. Olumide Bello, she would tease, pointing a wooden spoon at him one day, "You will become a rich man and forget all this suffering." And Olumide would always pull her closer and kiss her forehead. "Never," he promised every single time. "Even if I become the richest man in Lagos, I will never forget the woman who stood beside me when I had nothing." Back then, he truly believed those words. At 29, Olumide worked as a junior marketing officer for a struggling real estate company on Victoria Island. The pay was poor. The hours were brutal. Sometimes he returned home after midnight, exhausted and frustrated after being insulted by wealthy clients who barely noticed his existence. But Abibat never allowed him to drown in shame. When his salary came late for 3 straight months, she secretly sold her gold earrings to pay their rent without telling him. When his old car broke down permanently beside Third Mainland Bridge, she woke up at 5 every morning to prepare a kara and bread she could sell near the bus stop before going to her tailoring job. She protected his pride even when life was humiliating both of them. That was why Olumide loved her so deeply in the beginning. At least he thought he did. Years later, when success finally came into his life, he would forget how many nights Abibat slept hungry so he could eat first. The promotion happened shortly after Olumide turned 33. A wealthy businessman named Chief Adekunle noticed him during an important property negotiation and admired the way Olumide handled difficult investors calmly under pressure. Within 6 months, Olumide became one of the youngest senior executives inside the company. Suddenly, everything changed. The couple moved from their cramped apartment into a modern flat in Lekki. Olumide started wearing expensive suits and attending elite business dinners where politicians, celebrities, and wealthy entrepreneurs drank champagne beneath golden lights. At first, Abibat was proud of him. She ironed his clothes carefully every morning and waited awake at night to hear stories about his new world. But slowly, that world began changing him. The first signs were small. Olumide started correcting the way she spoke English during dinners. He complained that her village accent embarrassed him around executives. Then he stopped taking her to important events altogether. "She won't feel comfortable there," he told co-workers casually. But the truth was far uglier. Olumide had started becoming ashamed of the woman who once carried him through poverty. One evening during a company celebration, Abibat overheard 2 wealthy women laughing near the buffet tables. "Is that really his wife?" one whispered. "She looks too ordinary for a man at his level." The words pierced deeper than they realized. That night, Abibat stood silently before the bathroom mirror, studying herself for almost an hour after returning home. Her skin looked tired. Years of stress had softened the brightness in her face. Her hands carried tiny scars from tailoring needles and hot cooking oil. When Olumide entered the bedroom, he found her staring quietly at her reflection. "What's wrong?" he asked while removing his wristwatch. Abibat forced a smile. "Do you think I still look beautiful?" Olumide paused only briefly before answering. "Of course," but his voice lacked the certainty it once carried, and Abibat noticed. A few months later, everything became worse. The sickness began with exhaustion. Abibat suddenly grew weak while working. Some mornings she could barely rise from bed without dizziness. Her hands trembled while sewing clothes. Persistent pain spread through her body like invisible fire. At first she hid it from Olumide because his career was finally thriving. But eventually, the symptoms became impossible to ignore. After several hospital visits, the doctors delivered devastating news. An autoimmune illness was slowly damaging her kidneys. The treatment would be expensive, long-term expensive. Abibat still remembered the silence inside the doctor's office after the diagnosis. Olumide sat frozen beside her while the doctor explained medication schedules and future risks carefully. "Can she recover?" Olumide asked quietly. The doctor hesitated. "She can survive with proper treatment and emotional support," he answered gently. "But stress will worsen her condition very quickly." For several weeks afterward, Olumide tried to behave like the loving husband he used to be. He paid hospital bills. He accompanied her to appointments. He reassured worried relatives over the phone. But inside him, fear had already begun transforming into resentment. The illness interrupted everything. Business trips became difficult. Late-night events became uncomfortable because he constantly worried about emergency calls from home. Medical expenses started swallowing money faster than he expected. Worst of all, Abibat no longer looked like the energetic woman who once danced in their kitchen. The medication caused weight loss and weakness. Dark circles formed beneath her eyes. Sometimes she became too tired to leave bed for entire days. And while Abibat fought desperately to survive, Olumide slowly began mourning the glamorous future he believed sickness had stolen from him. One rainy evening in Lagos, Abibat waited near the dining table for over 3 hours with untouched soup growing cold in front of her. Olumide finally returned home after midnight, smelling faintly of expensive perfume unfamiliar to her. "You didn't answer my calls," she whispered weakly. "I was busy." With work, Olumide loosened his tie impatiently. "Abibat, not every conversation has to become an interrogation." She lowered her eyes immediately. "I'm sorry." But as Olumide walked toward the bedroom, something inside him shifted further away from her than ever before. Because earlier that same evening, inside a luxury rooftop restaurant overlooking Lagos, Lights Olumide Bello had spent 3 hours laughing with a beautiful rising fashion model named Sarah Adebayo. And for the first time in years, he had completely forgotten his sick wife was waiting for him at home. Sarah Adebayo entered Olumide Bello's life like sunlight entering a room that had been dark for too long. At least that was how Olumide justified everything to himself afterward. She was young, elegant, and impossible to ignore. Her photographs appeared on fashion billboards across Lagos. Luxury brands invited her to private events. Men stared whenever she entered restaurants, and women studied her beauty with silent envy. But what affected Olumide most was not simply her appearance. It was the way Sarah made him feel about himself. Important, desired, alive. The second time they met happened during an investment party at Echo Hotel. Olumide had attended alongside wealthy developers and government officials, while Sarah arrived as the guest face of a luxury fashion company sponsoring the event. That night, Abibat was lying in bed with severe fever after another painful treatment session. Olumide almost stayed home. Almost. But Abibat herself encouraged him to go. "You worked hard for this position," she whispered weakly while pressing a warm towel against her forehead. "You shouldn't miss opportunities because of me." Olumide kissed her gently before leaving. "You rest," he told her. "I won't stay long." Yet hours later, he found himself seated beside Sarah near the rooftop lounge while soft music floated through the warm Lagos night air. She laughed easily at his jokes. She touched his arm while speaking. Most dangerously of all, she listened carefully whenever he talked about business ambitions and frustrations. Unlike Abibat, Sarah belonged naturally inside the glamorous world Olumide desperately wanted to claim as his own. So she asked while sipping wine slowly, "Why does a successful man like you always look stressed?" Olumide smiled faintly. "Success is more complicated than people think." Sarah tilted her head thoughtfully. "You carry responsibility like someone twice your age." The words touched something fragile inside him. For months his life had revolved around sickness, medications, hospital bills, and exhaustion. At home, every conversation carried the weight of pain. Every room smelled faintly of medicine. Every day felt heavy. But beside Sarah, life suddenly felt light again. exciting again. When Olumide finally checked his phone near midnight, he discovered 7 missed calls from Abibat. Guilt hit him immediately. "I should go," he said quickly while standing. Sarah looked up at him calmly. "To your wife," Olumide froze slightly. "You know I'm married." She gave a small smile. Everyone important in Lagos talks. Something about her tone unsettled him. Not judgment, not disappointment. Almost amusement. Still, Olumide returned home carrying flowers he purchased hurriedly from a roadside vendor to ease his conscience. But the moment he stepped into the apartment, the atmosphere changed. Abibat sat curled weakly on the living room sofa beneath a blanket. The electricity had gone out earlier, leaving only dim, rechargeable lantern light glowing across the room. "You're home," she whispered softly. Olumide immediately noticed her swollen eyes. "You've been crying." She tried smiling. "No, I was just worried." Her voice sounded fragile enough to break. "The hospital called," she continued carefully. "The doctor wants additional tests next week." Olumide loosened his tie tiredly. Again, Abibat lowered her gaze. "They said the inflammation markers are increasing." For several seconds, silence filled the apartment. Not the comfortable silence they once shared years earlier. This silence carried distance, pressure, resentment neither of them wanted to name aloud. Olumide placed the flowers awkwardly on the table. "I'm exhausted, Abibat." "I know." "No, you don't understand." His voice hardened slightly. "Every single day there's another problem, another bill, another emergency." Instant regret flashed through him after the words escaped. Abibat stared at him quietly, as if he had slapped her. "I didn't choose to become sick," she whispered. Olumide rubbed his forehead heavily. "I know that," but inside him frustration kept growing anyway. Over the following months, the emotional affair deepened slowly. Dangerously slowly. Olumide began texting Sarah constantly between meetings. He started inventing business dinners that never existed. Sometimes he sat inside his parked car for almost an hour before going home, simply because he could not bear another evening surrounded by sickness and sadness. Meanwhile, Abibat noticed everything. Women always notice first. She noticed how quickly Olumide smiled while looking at his phone. She noticed the expensive new cologne he suddenly started wearing. She noticed how impatient he became whenever she spoke too long about hospital appointments or pain. Most painful of all, she noticed he rarely touched her anymore. One afternoon, Abibat stood quietly outside the bedroom doorway while Olumide adjusted his cufflinks before another corporate event. "You look handsome," she said softly. "Thank you. Will you be late tonight?" "Probably." She hesitated nervously before speaking again. "Maybe this weekend we can spend time together. Even if it's just somewhere simple near the beach." Olumide sighed immediately. "Abibat, you know weekends are busy for me now." Her face fell slightly. "It's been months since we really talked. We are talking now." "No." Tears gathered slowly in her eyes. "We live inside the same house, but you left me emotionally a long time ago." Olumide turned away quickly. "I can't do this conversation again." What conversation? The truth. The question followed him all the way out the door. That same night, while Abibat struggled alone through another wave of severe pain, Olumide sat inside an exclusive nightclub laughing beside Sarah and wealthy investors. Music vibrated through the glowing room. Champagne bottles sparkled beneath blue lights. And for the first time since his marriage began falling apart, Olumide allowed himself to imagine another future entirely. A healthier wife, a glamorous partner beside him at public events, a woman who elevated his image instead of reminding him daily about weakness, sacrifice, and suffering. By the end of the evening, Sarah rested her hand lightly against his chest while they stood overlooking Lagos traffic below. "You deserve happiness too," she murmured. Olumide stared at her silently, because deep inside, he already knew he was crossing a line he could never uncross. A week later, the betrayal became physical. It happened inside a luxury apartment Sarah used during modeling campaigns near Banana Island. Afterward, Olumide sat at the edge of the bed, unable to breathe properly, beneath the crushing weight of guilt suddenly consuming him. He pictured Abibat instantly, her tired eyes, her trembling hands. the woman who once sold her jewelry to protect his dignity. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked lazily from behind him. Olumide buried his face in his hands. "I shouldn't be here, but you are." Her answer came calmly, coldly, and somehow that frightened him more. Later that night, he returned home long after midnight again. The apartment was dark except for the kitchen light still glowing softly. Abibat sat alone at the table waiting. A pot of soup remained untouched between them. Olumide immediately sensed something was wrong. Then he noticed the object lying beside her hand, a printed photograph. Him and Sarah together at the nightclub. Someone had posted it online. Abibat's voice trembled painfully. "Tell me it isn't true." Olumide stared at the photograph silently, and in that devastating moment, he could no longer even force himself to lie to her. Olumide stood in front of the kitchen table for a long time, staring at the photograph as if silence could make it disappear. But silence only made the truth louder. Abibat sat across from him with both hands folded tightly in her lap. Her face was pale from illness, but her eyes were painfully awake. She had not shouted. She had not thrown anything. She had not behaved like the dramatic women people mocked in gossip. That hurt Olumide more because her quietness carried more grief than anger ever could. "Say something," she whispered. Olumide swallowed. It was a mistake. Abibat looked down at the photograph again. In it, Sarah's hand rested on his chest, while he smiled at her beneath nightclub lights. It was not the smile of a man trapped in a mistake. It was the smile of a man enjoying a life he had hidden from his wife. "A mistake happens once," Abibat said softly. "This looks like a life." The words entered Olumide like a knife, but instead of accepting the wound, he turned defensive. "You don't understand the pressure I'm under." Abibat lifted her eyes slowly. "What pressure makes a man forget his vows?" He looked away. Outside Lagos, rain tapped against the kitchen window. The soup on the table had gone cold. Abibat had cooked it with shaking hands hours earlier, hoping they might eat together like husband and wife again. Now the food sat between them like evidence of a love nobody was eating from anymore. "I am not happy," Abibat Olumide finally said. She blinked as if the words confused her. "You're not happy." His voice grew stronger, not because he was right, but because guilt often looks for anger to wear. "Yes, I am tired. I am tired of hospital visits. I am tired of bills. I am tired of coming home to pain every day. I am tired of feeling like my entire life has become one long sickness." Abibat's lips parted, but no sound came out. For years she had carried suffering quietly because she did not want to burden him. Now she realized that even her silence had become a burden in his mind. "I did not ask you to stop living," she said. "But you stopped living," he replied sharply. The moment he said it, something broke in the room. Abibat's face changed. Not because he had insulted her body, but because he had exposed the cruel way he now saw her. Not as his wife, not as the woman who once built his dreams beside him, but as a dead weight tied around the bright future he wanted. Her fingers trembled against her wrapper. "I am fighting to stay alive," she whispered. Olumide pressed his palms against the table. "And I am fighting not to drown with you." For the first time that night, tears rolled freely down Abibat's cheeks. She remembered the old Olumide, the young man who once cried into her lap after losing his job. She remembered pawning her earrings waking before sunrise, pretending she had eaten when there was only enough food for one person. She remembered believing that marriage meant carrying each other through the seasons no one applauded. But the man standing before her did not remember those things the same way. To him, those memories had become a poor beginning. He wanted to escape. "Do you love her?" Abibat asked. The question was so direct that Olumide froze. He wanted to say no. A decent man would have said no. A guilty man would have lied. But Olumide was no longer strong enough to pretend. "I don't know," he said. Abibat closed her eyes. That answer hurt more than a yes. For days after that night, the apartment became a silent battlefield. Olumide moved into the guest room. Abibat stopped asking when he would come home. She took her medication alone, attended appointments alone, and cried only inside the bathroom where running water could hide the sound. Olumide told himself he needed space to think. But he spent that space with Sarah. Sarah listened to him complain about marriage as if she were a gentle comfort, but her eyes sharpened with calculation whenever he spoke about divorce. She understood men like Olumide well. They wanted to feel noble even while doing selfish things. So she never pushed openly. She only planted words and let his weakness water them. "You're still young," she told him one evening inside a quiet restaurant on Victoria Island. "You can't sacrifice your whole life because of guilt." "She is sick," Olumide said. "And you are dying emotionally," Sarah replied. He stared into his drink. "She stood by me when I had nothing." Sarah reached across the table and touched his hand. "Then help her financially, but don't punish yourself forever because someone was kind to you in the past." The sentence sounded reasonable to a heart already looking for permission. By the following week, Olumide visited a lawyer. The office was cold and polished with glass walls and framed certificates that made cruelty look professional. The lawyer, barrister Nnamdi Okiki, spoke carefully after hearing Olumide's explanation. "Your wife's condition may make this sensitive," he said. Olumide frowned. "I am not abandoning her. I will provide support. Support is one thing. Timing is another. I need my life back." Barrister Nnamdi looked at him for a moment, perhaps wondering how often people use that sentence when they meant they wanted freedom from responsibility. Still, he opened a file. 2 days later, Olumide returned home with divorce papers inside a brown envelope. Abibat was sitting near the window, folding clean clothes slowly. Her hands were weaker than before. The afternoon sun fell across her thin face, revealing how much illness had taken from her body. Yet even in weakness, there remained a quiet dignity about her. Olumide stood near the doorway. "We need to talk." Abibat looked up. Something in his voice told her that this conversation had not come to repair anything. He placed the envelope on the table. She stared at it. "What is this?" He did not answer immediately. Her breathing changed. Slowly she reached for the envelope, opened it, and saw the papers inside. For several seconds she could not read properly. The words blurred. Divorce petition, separation terms, spousal support, legal dissolution. Her hand dropped to her lap. Olumide, she whispered, barely audible. He forced himself to remain calm. "I think this is best." "For who?" "For both of us." A small, broken laugh escaped her. "You brought divorce papers to your sick wife and told yourself it is for both of us." His jaw tightened. "I will pay for treatment. You think medicine is the same as love? I can't continue like this." Abibot tried to stand, but dizziness struck her immediately. She gripped the table, struggling to steady herself. Olumide stepped forward instinctively, but she raised one trembling hand to stop him. "No," she said. "Do not touch me like a husband after arriving as a stranger." He stopped. Her words entered him, but pride held him still. "You promised me forever," she continued. "Not forever until my body became inconvenient. Not forever until younger women smiled at you. Not forever until money made you ashamed of the woman who suffered with you." Olumide's face hardened because truth was cornering him. "You keep reminding me of the past, because the past is where your conscience died." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Abibot looked at the papers again. Her tears fell onto the top page, darkening the lawyer's neat print. "Is she worth this?" she asked. Olumide did not answer. That silence answered everything. By evening, word had already begun spreading through relatives. Olumide had told his elder sister Morenike, who then told others in careful half-truths. He said the marriage had become unhealthy. He said Abibot needed peace. He said he would continue paying medical bills. He did not say he had found comfort in another woman's arms. The next morning, Morenike arrived at the apartment wearing expensive perfume and a face full of fake concern. "My sister," she said, sitting beside Abibat. "Sometimes life changes. A woman must accept destiny." Abibat stared at her quietly. "Is betrayal destiny now Morenike's side?" "You are sick. My brother is still young. Should he die before his time because of pity?" Those words finally crushed something deep inside Abibat. Not because Morenike mattered, but because she realized Olumide had allowed others to discuss her life like spoiled property. 3 days later, weakened by fever and grief, Abibat signed the papers with a hand that could barely hold the pen. Olumide stood across the room watching. When she finished, she pushed the papers toward him without looking up. "I release you," she said. Relief flashed across his face before he could hide it. Abibat saw it. And that became the final wound. That night, as Olumide packed a suitcase and prepared to leave for the luxury apartment he had secretly rented, Abibat sat alone in the bedroom they once shared. On the bedside table lay their wedding photograph taken years earlier when both of them were poor but smiling with honest hope. She picked it up gently. For a moment she pressed it against her chest. Then pain surged through her body so violently that she gasped and bent forward, knocking her medication bottle onto the floor. In the hallway, Olumide heard the sound. He paused. For 1 second, the man he used to be almost turned back, but his phone buzzed. A message from Sarah appeared on the screen. "Are you free now, my love?" Olumide looked toward the bedroom door, then at the phone. Then he walked out of the apartment. Behind him, Abibat remained on the floor, too weak to call his name, clutching the wedding photograph as tears fell silently onto the faces of two people who no longer existed. The morning Abibat left Lagos, the city looked unusually gray. Rain clouds hung heavily above crowded roads while Danfo buses splashed muddy water across broken sidewalks. Traders shouted through traffic as if life had not just ended for someone nearby. Lagos continued breathing loudly, carelessly, without noticing the woman sitting quietly inside an old commercial bus with swollen eyes and a small travel bag resting on her lap. Abibat leaned her head against the dusty window and watched familiar streets disappear slowly behind her. The city where she once built dreams with Olumide no longer felt like home. Her body ached from illness and emotional exhaustion. The previous night she barely slept. Every corner of the apartment carried memories that now felt poisoned. The kitchen where they once danced. The sofa where Olumide used to fall asleep with his head in her lap after stressful workdays. The bedroom where promises about forever had quietly died. Now all of it belonged to strangers. Abibat tightened her wrapper around herself as a coughing fit shook her chest painfully. The elderly woman beside her looked over with concern. "My daughter." "Are you all right?" Abibat forced a weak smile. "I will be." But even she no longer believed those words completely. After signing the divorce papers, she had called the only person she could still trust fully, her mother's older sister, Aunt Sade, who lived in Ibadan. The moment Aunt Sade heard her voice over the phone, she already knew something terrible had happened. "Abibat," she asked softly, "why do you sound like someone crying in darkness?" That question alone had nearly broken her. Now 6 hours later, Abibat sat traveling toward the modest home where she spent part of her childhood before moving permanently to Lagos after marriage. She carried only a few clothes, her medications, and one framed wedding photograph she still could not throw away despite everything. Olumide had not come to say goodbye. Instead, his assistant transferred money into her account with a short message, "For your immediate needs." No apology, no warmth, just money, as if 20 years of love could be settled like an unpaid invoice. Halfway through the journey, Abibat's fever worsened. Sweat gathered across her forehead while sharp pain spread through her lower back and stomach. She tried drinking water, but nausea rose immediately afterward. The bus conductor noticed her trembling. "Madame, should we stop somewhere?" Abibat shook her head weakly. "No, I'm okay." But she was not okay. Her vision blurred repeatedly as the bus moved along the highway. Voices around her sounded distant. At one point, she gripped the edge of her seat so tightly, her fingers cramped. The woman beside her touched her shoulder gently. "You need hospital." Abibat smiled faintly. "I'm tired of hospitals." The truth was deeper than physical exhaustion. She was tired of being treated like a burden. Tired of watching pity replace love in people's eyes. Tired of surviving for others while slowly disappearing inside herself. By the time the bus finally reached Ibadan, in the late afternoon, Abibat could barely stand properly. Aunt Saad was waiting near the roadside market wearing a faded Ankara wrapper and worn slippers. The older woman's face tightened with pain the moment she saw how thin Abibat had become. "Jesus!" Aunt Saad whispered under her breath before rushing forward. Abibat tried smiling. "Auntie." But the second Aunt Saad hugged her, Abibat collapsed against her shoulder and burst into tears so violently that nearby traders turned to look. "Auntie, he left me," she sobbed. "He really left me." Aunt Sade held her tightly beside the noisy roadside while vehicles rushed past them. "Cry," she whispered. "Let your heart release it." That evening, rain poured heavily over Ibadan, while Abibat lay curled beneath a thin blanket inside her aunt's small two-room house. The home was simple. Old wooden chairs, a tiny television balanced on a crate, faded curtains moving gently beneath the wind. But unlike the luxury apartment in Lakey, this place still carried love inside its walls. Aunt Saad sat beside the bed, rubbing Abibat's back slowly after another painful coughing fit. "Did he beat you?" she asked quietly. Abibat shook her head weakly. "No." Then what happened? For several seconds, Abibat stared silently at the ceiling before answering. He became ashamed of suffering. Aunt Saad frowned. "What does that mean?" Abibat swallowed hard. "When we were poor together, I thought love made us strong. But when money came, suffering became ugly to him. My sickness reminded him of the life he no longer wanted." Tears filled Aunt Saad's eyes instantly. "After all you did for that man," Abibat gave a broken smile. "I kept believing the old Olumide would return. And now," she closed her eyes slowly, "I don't know who he is anymore." That night, while Abibat struggled through fever inside the modest house in Ibadan, Olumide attended an elite private gathering beside Sarah at a luxury rooftop lounge in Lagos. Music floated through golden lights while wealthy guests praised them openly. "You two look perfect together. Beautiful couple. Olumide, this woman upgraded your image completely." Each compliment fed something dangerous inside him. Validation, freedom, the feeling that he had escaped sadness and entered a better life. Sarah leaned comfortably against him while photographers snapped pictures. "You seem happier lately," she whispered. Olumide smiled faintly. "Maybe I finally chose myself." But somewhere beneath the champagne music and expensive perfume, guilt remained alive. Small, quiet, but alive. Back in Ibadan, Abibat woke shortly after midnight, struggling to breathe. Pain spread sharply through her chest while dizziness overwhelmed her. She tried sitting upright, but her body felt unbearably weak. "Auntie?" she called softly. No answer. Again. "Auntie?" This time the older woman rushed into the room immediately. The moment Aunt Saad saw Abibat gasping for air, panic filled her face. "Ya Allah!" Within minutes, neighbors helped carry Abibat into an old taxi beneath the rain. The nearest public hospital was overcrowded even at night. Patients filled hallways. Nurses moved quickly between crying children and exhausted families. The smell of antiseptic and humidity hung heavily in the air. Abibat lay trembling on a narrow hospital bed while doctors worked around her. "She's severely dehydrated," one nurse said urgently. Blood pressure dropping. Aunt Said stood nearby, praying quietly beneath her breath. For hours, Abibat drifted in and out of consciousness. At one point, she opened her eyes slightly and saw Aunt Saad crying silently beside the bed. "Auntie?" she whispered weakly. "Yes, my child. Please don't hate him." The older woman stared at her in disbelief. "That man abandoned you while you were dying." Abibat's lips trembled faintly. "Hate destroys the person carrying it." Aunt Sade wiped tears from her cheeks angrily. "You still love him?" After this, Abibat turned her face slowly toward the hospital ceiling. Love. The word itself now felt painful. What she felt was no longer the joyful love of young marriage. It was grief. Grief for the man Olumide used to be. Grief for the future they buried together. Grief for the version of herself who once believed loyalty guaranteed safety. The following morning, after doctors stabilized her condition temporarily, Abibat sat quietly near the hospital window, watching sunlight spread slowly across Ibadan streets. Her body remained weak. Her marriage was gone. Her future uncertain. Yet somewhere deep inside her broken heart, a tiny voice still whispered something stubborn: survive. Not for revenge, not to prove anything to Olumide, but because her life still mattered, even if the man she loved failed to see it. As sunlight touched her tired face, Abibat closed her eyes gently, and for the first time since the divorce, she allowed herself to imagine a future where healing might still exist beyond betrayal. 3 months after divorcing, Abibat Olumide Bello stood beneath golden chandeliers inside one of the most expensive wedding venues in Lagos and smiled for cameras as if he had never destroyed anyone's life to arrive there. The entire city seemed obsessed with the wedding. Celebrity blogs posted photographs every hour. Fashion influencers praised Sarah Adebayo's custom diamond-covered gown. Politicians, musicians, business executives, and socialites filled the luxurious ballroom while waiters carried silver trays through clouds of expensive perfume and laughter. To outsiders, Olumide looked like a man finally stepping into the glamorous destiny he deserved. Only a few people noticed the exhaustion hiding behind his carefully practiced smile. "Sir, look this way." Camera flashes exploded repeatedly while Sarah leaned elegantly against him for photographs. She looked flawless beneath the lights, beautiful, poised, admired by everyone in the room. And she loved every second of being admired. "You need to smile more naturally," she whispered quietly through her teeth while photographers circled them. "You look tense." Olumide forced another smile immediately. "I'm fine." "No, you're thinking too much again." Thinking. Yes, because despite the music, luxury, and applause surrounding him, part of Olumide's mind remained trapped elsewhere. A hospital bed, a trembling voice, tears falling silently onto divorce papers. He pushed the memories away quickly. This was supposed to be his new beginning. At the same moment, an Ibadan Abibat sat upright on a crowded hospital bed while an old television hanging near the ceiling played entertainment news. Patients around her watched absent-mindedly as reporters discussed celebrity weddings and fashion trends between advertisements. Then suddenly, Sarah's smiling face appeared on the screen. Tonight, Lagos businessman Olumide Bello officially tied the knot with famous model Sarah Adebayo in what many are calling the wedding of the year. Abibot froze. The remote slipped slightly from her weak fingers. On-screen cameras showed Olumide standing proudly beside Sarah while guests applauded. The nurse adjusting medication beside Abibot noticed her expression immediately. "You know them," Abibot tried answering, but her throat tightened painfully. "That—" She swallowed hard. "That is my ex-husband." The nurse's eyes widened. For several seconds she stared between the television and Abibot's thin face, struggling to process the cruel coincidence. "Oh." It was the only thing she could say. Abibot forced herself to keep watching, even though every image felt like someone pressing broken glass into her chest. Sarah looked radiant beside the man who once promised to love Abibot through sickness and hardship. Olumide looked free, happy, untouched by guilt. The television reporter continued excitedly. Sources close to the couple described their romance as passionate and inspiring. Abibot suddenly reached for the remote and muted the television. The room fell silent except for distant hospital noises. Her breathing became uneven. The nurse whose name tag read Yetunde sat carefully beside her bed. "You should rest," Yetunde said gently. Abibot nodded faintly. But resting was impossible, because until that moment, part of her still carried the foolish hope that Olumide might eventually regret what he had done. Seeing him remarry so publicly shattered that illusion completely. Later that evening, after most patients had fallen asleep, Abibot sat alone near the hospital window, wrapped in a thin blanket. Rain tapped softly against the glass, while pain spread through her body in familiar waves. Yet the emotional pain felt worse tonight, far worse. Aunt Sadi entered quietly, carrying a small flask of warm tea. "You haven't eaten. I'm not hungry." Aunt Sadi sat beside her. "I heard some nurses discussing that wedding downstairs." Abibot lowered her eyes. "Everybody is discussing it. You should stop watching those things." Abibot laughed weakly. "I didn't go looking for it. It found me." For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Aunt Saad reached over and squeezed her hand gently. "My daughter, some people lose their souls while chasing beautiful lives." Tears gathered slowly in Abibot's eyes. "I keep asking myself what I did wrong." "You became sick," Aunt Sade answered firmly. "That is not a crime. But maybe I stopped being the woman he needed." "No." Aunt Sade's voice sharpened immediately. "Do not carry his sin on your head. A faithful man does not abandon his wife because suffering arrived." Abibot stared quietly through the rain-covered window. The truth was, she still missed him terribly. Not the man from the wedding photographs, not the cold stranger who delivered divorce papers. She missed the young Olumide, who once held her hand during long bus rides and whispered dreams about the future. Grief became confusing when the person you mourn was still alive. Meanwhile, in Lagos, the wedding celebration continued deep into the night. Music shook the ballroom while wealthy guests danced beneath rotating lights. Sarah moved gracefully between powerful people, charming investors, and celebrities effortlessly. Olumide watched her from across the room. Everyone admired her. Everyone envied him. Yet something inside him remained unsettled. At one point, an older businessman named Chief Banjoko approached with a glass of whiskey. "Congratulations, my boy." "Thank you, sir." Chief Banjoko studied him carefully. "You should look happier." Olumide forced a small laugh. "I'm tired from planning." The older man nodded slowly. Then unexpectedly he asked, "What happened to your first wife?" Olumide stiffened slightly. She moved back to Ibadan. Chief Banjoko sipped his drink thoughtfully. "I met her once, years ago. Quiet woman? Respectful?" Olumide said nothing. The older man continued calmly. "Women who suffer with men during poverty are rare." A strange discomfort tightened inside Olumide's chest. "Life became complicated," he muttered. Chief Banjoko looked directly at him. "No. Human beings make life complicated when gratitude disappears." The sentence hit harder than Olumide expected. Before he could respond, Sarah appeared beside him, smiling brightly. "There you are," she laughed, sliding her arm through his. "Everyone is waiting for us to cut the cake." Chief Banjoko gave Olumide one final look before walking away slowly. For the rest of the evening, those words refused to leave Olumide's mind. When gratitude disappears. Near midnight, after most guests had left, Olumide and Sarah finally arrived at their luxury apartment overlooking Lagos waters. Rose petals covered the bedroom. Candles flickered softly. Everything looked perfect. But perfection can feel strangely empty when built on unresolved guilt. Sarah removed her jewelry while studying him through the mirror. "You've been distracted all night." Olumide loosened his collar silently. "I'm fine." "No, you're thinking about her again." He looked up sharply. Sarah crossed her arms. "You do this every time someone mentions your ex-wife. She was part of my life for many years. And now she isn't." Sarah's tone hardened slightly. "You need to stop behaving like a man attending his own funeral." Olumide frowned. "That's unfair. What's unfair is standing beside your new wife while emotionally living somewhere else." Silence filled the room. Then Sarah walked closer. "Listen carefully," she said quietly. "I did not marry a man chained to guilt. If you wanted to remain emotionally married to a sick woman, you should never have divorced her." The cruelty of the sentence shocked even Olumide slightly, yet part of him knew he deserved hearing it, because somewhere deep inside, beneath all the luxury and excitement, he already understood something terrifying. He had sacrificed peace for appearances, and appearances never stayed warm for long. Back in Ibadan, long after midnight, Abibat remained awake staring at the hospital ceiling while rain continued falling outside. Most patients slept quietly around her. Yetunde approached softly, carrying medication. "You should try sleeping." Abibat accepted the medicine weakly. "Does heartbreak ever stop hurting?" she asked suddenly. The nurse paused, then she pulled a chair beside the bed. "My husband died 6 years ago," Yetunde said gently. "For a long time I believed pain would kill me before grief did." Abibat turned toward her slowly. "What changed?" Yetunde smiled sadly. "One day I realized survival is also a form of worship. God keeps waking us up because our story is not finished yet." Abibat stared at her quietly. Her story. Right now it felt ruined beyond repair. Still, as dawn slowly approached outside the hospital windows, a tiny part of her heart continued beating stubbornly beneath all the grief. Not because she stopped hurting, but because something inside her refused to die completely, and neither she nor Olumide understood yet that the life both of them believed was over had only just begun changing shape. The first person who truly saw Abibat again was not family, not a former friend, not even a doctor. It was Nurse Yetunde. Every morning at exactly 6:30, Yetunde walked through the crowded hospital ward, carrying patient files, medication trays, and the exhaustion of someone who spent her life caring for strangers. She was in her early 40s with tired eyes and a voice gentle enough to calm frightened children during injections. Most nurses treated patients kindly. Yetunde treated them like human beings whose dignity mattered. That difference changed everything for Abibat. 3 weeks had passed since Olumide's wedding. Abibat remained weak, but her condition had stabilized enough for doctors to stop worrying about immediate organ failure. Still, recovery moved painfully slowly. Some days she could barely sit upright without dizziness. Other days, grief returned so heavily that even swallowing food felt difficult. Yetunde noticed all of it. One morning she entered the ward and found Abibat staring blankly through the window while untouched pap sat growing cold beside her bed. "You haven't eaten again," Yetunde said gently. "I'm not hungry." "That answer is becoming your favorite hobby." Abibat smiled faintly for the first time in days. Yetunde sat beside the bed and adjusted the blanket covering her legs. "You know," she said quietly, "pain can become addictive." Abibat frowned slightly. "How?" "Sometimes suffering becomes the only thing people think they deserve anymore." The words settled deeply inside her, because secretly Abibat had begun feeling exactly that way, unworthy, discarded, like a woman life itself no longer wanted. That afternoon, Yetunde convinced her to walk slowly through the hospital courtyard for fresh air. The courtyard was small and overcrowded, filled with anxious relatives, tired patients, and children chasing each other between plastic chairs. Abibat moved carefully beside Yetunde, one hand gripping the nurse's arm for support. "You are improving?" Yetunde encouraged. "It doesn't feel like it. Healing rarely feels beautiful while it is happening." Abibat lowered her eyes. "What if my life never becomes anything except survival?" Yetunde stopped walking. Then she pointed quietly toward an elderly man seated beneath a mango tree near the hospital fence. The old man wore faded clothes and held a small notebook while speaking softly to a little girl whose head was wrapped in bandages. "That man lost his wife and 2 sons in one car accident," Yetunde said. "Afterward, he became so depressed he stopped speaking for almost a year." Abibat stared quietly. "Who is he, Dr. Afolayan?" Abibat blinked in surprise. "A doctor?" "One of the best kidney specialists in southwestern Nigeria before retirement." The elderly man looked nothing like the wealthy specialists Abibat remembered from Lagos hospitals. His slippers were worn, his shoulders slightly bent with age, yet the little girl beside him laughed freely while he drew funny pictures inside the notebook. "He still comes here 3 days a week," Yetunde continued. "He says grief should never make us useless to others." Something about those words lingered inside Abibat long after they returned to the ward. The following morning, she met Dr. Afolayan properly for the first time. He arrived carrying old medical books beneath one arm and greeted every patient before approaching her bed. So he said warmly, adjusting his glasses, "You are the stubborn woman refusing to eat." Abibat looked embarrassed. "I'm trying. Trying is not eating." A small smile touched her lips again. Dr. Afolayan reviewed her medical files slowly. Unlike other rushed physicians, he read carefully, asking detailed questions about symptoms, medication, reactions, emotional stress, and previous treatment history in Lagos. Several times his expression darkened thoughtfully. Finally, he looked up. "Who handled your earlier treatment?" Abibat mentioned the hospital. Dr. Afolayan leaned back silently. Yetunde noticed his reaction immediately. "What is it, doctor?" He tapped the file lightly. "Some important tests were delayed too long." Abibat's stomach tightened. Delayed Dr. Afolayan nodded carefully. "Your illness is serious, yes. But based on these reports, I believe your condition became worse because your treatment plan lacked proper consistency and specialist supervision." Abibat stared at him. "Are you saying I could have improved earlier?" The doctor chose his words cautiously. "I am saying your case may not be as hopeless as you were made to believe." For several seconds, the room felt strangely still. Hope entered quietly, carefully, almost fearfully, because hope can feel dangerous to people who have suffered disappointment too long. Abibat swallowed hard. "Can I recover?" Dr. Afolayan smiled gently. "Recovery is not magic. It requires discipline, emotional stability, medication, nutrition, and patience. But yes, I believe you still have a future if you fight properly for it." The words hit Abibat so powerfully that tears filled her eyes instantly. A future. Not merely survival. A future. After the doctor left, Yetunde squeezed her hand excitedly. "You heard him?" But Abibot began crying softly, not from sadness this time, from exhaustion. Because for months she had been emotionally preparing herself to die slowly while watching the man she loved abandon her. Now suddenly, someone was telling her life might still continue, and she did not yet know how to hold that possibility without breaking. Meanwhile, in Lagos, Olumide's new marriage was already beginning to reveal cracks beneath the glamorous surface. At first he ignored them. Sarah remained beautiful, admired, and socially perfect. But marriage exposed things dating never does. She hated inconvenience. She became irritated whenever Olumide worked late instead of attending events with her. She mocked ordinary people openly in ways that made him uncomfortable. Worst of all, she treated service workers with cold arrogance. One evening inside an upscale restaurant, a young waitress accidentally spilled water near their table. Before the terrified girl could apologize properly, Sarah snapped sharply. "Can people no longer do basic jobs correctly in this country?" The waitress apologized repeatedly. Olumide watched the scene silently. Then unexpectedly, he remembered Abibat years earlier helping clean spilled soup from a roadside restaurant floor after another customer slipped accidentally. Back then she had laughed while cleaning. No human being deserves humiliation over mistakes, she once told him afterward. The memory unsettled him deeply. Later that night, Olumide stood alone on the balcony overlooking Lagos lights, while Sarah spoke loudly on the phone inside. For reasons he could not fully explain, he suddenly wondered whether Abibat had eaten dinner. The thought irritated him immediately. Why was he still thinking about her? Because guilt does not disappear simply because someone buys a more beautiful life. Back in Ibadan, Abibat slowly began changing. Not dramatically. Healing rarely arrives dramatically. It arrived in tiny moments. The first morning she finished an entire meal. The first afternoon she walked across the courtyard without assistance. The first evening she laughed softly after Yetund told a ridiculous story about a patient secretly hiding fried chicken beneath his hospital pillow. Small things, human things, alive things. One afternoon, Yetunde found Abibat helping another patient's elderly mother arrange medication bottles correctly. "You should rest," Yetunde said. Abibat smiled softly. She looked confused. The older woman sitting nearby touched Abibat's hand gratefully. "God will bless you, my daughter." Something warm moved through Abibat's chest unexpectedly. Purpose. Not the dramatic kind. Not wealth or status, simply the feeling that her pain had not erased her ability to comfort others. Later that evening, Dr. Afalayan sat beside her during rounds. "You know what I notice about you?" he asked. Abibat shook her head. "Even while hurting, you keep paying attention to other people." She looked down quietly. "I know what it feels like to suffer alone." The doctor nodded slowly. "That is exactly why some wounded people become healers." The sentence stayed with her long after he walked away. That night, for the first time since her divorce, Abibat opened the small travel bag beside her bed and removed the framed wedding photograph she still carried everywhere. She stared at it for several minutes. The younger version of herself looked happy beside Olumide, hopeful, safe. Slowly, Abibat touched the glass covering his face. Then, with trembling hands, she turned the photograph backward and placed it inside the drawer beside her hospital bed. Not because she stopped loving him completely, but because for the first time, she was beginning to understand that surviving might require learning how to love herself again too. By the 6th month of his marriage to Sarah Olumide, Bello began understanding a painful truth. Beauty can attract attention, but it cannot create peace. The realization came slowly through dozens of small moments that chipped away at the fantasy he had sacrificed everything to chase. At first he blamed stress, business pressure, marriage adjustment, but deep down Olumide already knew something was wrong. The apartment that once felt exciting now felt strangely cold despite its luxury. Silence inside the home no longer carried comfort. It carried competition, pride, and emotional distance. Sarah loved being admired. She loved expensive vacations, luxury shopping, social media attention, celebrity parties, and photographs that made strangers envy her life. But she did not know how to sit beside another human being during suffering. And now that Olumide's emotional excitement had faded, he could finally see the emptiness hidden beneath the glamour. One Saturday morning, he woke early after a sleepless night and walked quietly into the kitchen. The house was silent except for the distant hum of air conditioning. He opened the refrigerator and stared blankly inside. Nothing homemade, nothing warm, nothing personal. Only imported drinks, fruit trays prepared by hired staff, and untouched restaurant leftovers. Suddenly, without warning, he remembered Abibot standing barefoot in their old apartment kitchen years earlier, laughing while frying plantains because they could not afford meat that week. "You always burn the edges," he used to tease her. "And you always eat everything anyway," she would reply. The memory struck so sharply that he closed the refrigerator immediately. Behind him, Sarah entered the kitchen wearing an expensive silk robe while scrolling through her phone. "You're awake early," she said casually. "I couldn't sleep." She barely looked up. Olumide watched her silently for several seconds. Not long ago, simply seeing her had filled him with excitement. Now he felt strangely lonely standing beside her. "Do you want breakfast?" he asked. Sarah laughed lightly. "At this hour, absolutely not. I have a photo shoot tomorrow." Then she walked away while still staring at her screen. That small moment should not have mattered. Yet somehow it did. Because Abibot had once learned complicated soup recipes simply because Olumide mentioned missing certain childhood meals. Love had lived inside details with her. With Sarah, everything revolved around appearances. Over the following weeks, the emotional distance between them grew worse. Sarah constantly criticized things that embarrassed her socially. She hated visiting Olumide's older relatives in Surulere because the neighborhood looked too local. She complained when he donated money to struggling extended family members. Most disturbingly, she openly mocked illness. One evening, while watching television coverage about a charity fundraiser for kidney patients, Sarah rolled her eyes dismissively. "Honestly, some people just become permanent victims," she muttered. Olumide looked at her sharply. "What do you mean?" "She spent years sick while expecting you to pause your life forever. That's emotional imprisonment." The room fell silent instantly. Olumide stared at his wife carefully. "Abibot never forced me to stay." Sarah crossed her arms. "Oh, please. Men like you stay because guilt manipulates you." Something inside Olumide tightened painfully. Because despite everything he knew one truth clearly, Abibot never manipulated him. She loved him honestly until the very end. That realization became harder to ignore each day. Meanwhile, in Ibadan, Abibot continued recovering slowly under Dr. Afolayan's supervision. Her strength improved enough for her to leave the hospital twice a week and spend afternoons at Aunt Sade's house again. Though still physically fragile, she no longer looked like someone fading toward death. There were still difficult days. Days when grief returned suddenly after hearing old songs. Days when loneliness felt unbearable at night. But healing had started rooting itself quietly inside her life. One afternoon, Yetunde visited Aunt Sade's home carrying fresh fruit and medication updates. She found Abibot sitting outside beneath a mango tree, helping neighborhood children repair torn school uniforms using Aunt Sade's old sewing machine. The children laughed around her while she worked carefully. Yetunde smiled warmly. "Look at you." Abibot laughed softly. They brought uniforms nobody else wanted to fix. "You look alive again." The sentence surprised Abibot more than it should have. Alive. Not merely breathing. Alive. Later that evening, while the children played nearby, Yetunde spoke privately with her. "You know Dr. Afolayan keeps praising you." Abibot looked embarrassed. "He is just kind." "No. He says emotional recovery is helping your body respond better to treatment." Abibot became quiet. Then she asked the question still haunting her. "Do people ever fully recover from betrayal?" Yetunde considered carefully before answering. "No. But eventually betrayal stops being the center of your identity." The words stayed with Abibot long afterward. Back in Lagos, Olumide's business life suddenly began facing unexpected pressure. A major property investment deal collapsed after several investors withdrew funding unexpectedly. Financial tension spread quickly through the company. Meetings became hostile. Shareholders demanded explanations. Olumide returned home increasingly exhausted and irritable. For the first time since their marriage, Sarah showed genuine frustration at his stress instead of sympathy. "You're always moody lately," she complained one night while removing makeup in front of the mirror. "I'm dealing with serious business problems. And I'm dealing with a husband who behaves emotionally unavailable." Olumide rubbed his forehead. "Can we not fight tonight?" "I'm not fighting. I'm tired of negative energy. Negative energy. The phrase irritated him instantly. Because when Abibat was sick, she never once described his struggles as inconvenience. Even during her worst pain, she still asked about his work, still encouraged him, still believed in him. Now standing in a luxury bedroom beside the woman he abandoned everything for, Olumide suddenly felt poorer emotionally than he had during his early struggling years. A few days later, the illusion shattered further. Olumide arrived unexpectedly at a private lounge after leaving a stressful meeting early. As he approached the VIP section, he heard Sarah laughing loudly with two friends nearby. None of them noticed him immediately. I swear one friend laughed. You secured the softest rich man in Lagos. Sarah smirked while sipping champagne. Please, men like Olumide are easy. Just tell them they deserve happiness. The women burst into laughter. Olumide froze. Another friend leaned closer. But honestly, would you still stay if he lost money? Sarah shrugged carelessly. I didn't marry struggle. The words entered Olumide like cold steel. For several seconds, he simply stood there, listening silently, as the woman he destroyed his marriage for discussed him like a successful transaction. Then Sarah finally noticed him standing nearby. Her face changed immediately. Babe Olumide turned and walked away before she could finish. He drove through Lagos for almost 2 hours afterward without destination. Traffic lights blurred through the windshield while memories flooded him relentlessly. Abibot waking early to iron his shirts. Abibot massaging his shoulders after long workdays. Abibot hiding her own hunger during their poor years. Abibot crying silently while signing divorce papers. For the first time since abandoning her, Olumide allowed himself to ask the question he had avoided for months. What if he had destroyed the best thing that ever happened to him? That night, he sat alone inside his parked car outside the apartment building long after midnight. He could not bring himself to go upstairs. Inside the vehicle, silence pressed heavily against him. Then slowly, painfully, real tears filled his eyes. Not dramatic tears, not self-pity. The quiet tears of a man beginning to understand that some mistakes do not simply ruin marriages. They ruin the version of yourself you once respected. And somewhere far away in Ibadan, the woman he abandoned was slowly becoming stronger without him, while he, despite all his luxury and success, was finally beginning to fall apart inside. The first meal Abibot cooked for strangers was not planned. It happened on a humid Tuesday afternoon outside the hospital pharmacy in Ibadan. She had accompanied Aunt Saad for a follow-up appointment and was sitting quietly beneath a faded umbrella near the entrance while waiting for Yetunde to finish her shift. Her strength had improved greatly over the past 2 months, though long walks still exhausted her quickly. Nearby, a young woman sat on the curb holding a crying child whose stomach looked painfully swollen from hunger. The child could not have been older than 4. Mama, food, he whimpered weakly. The mother lowered her face in shame. I know my baby. Just wait small. Abibot watched silently. The woman's clothes were clean but worn. Her eyes carried the hollow exhaustion of someone fighting battles invisible to the world. Without thinking too deeply, Abibot opened the small food flask Aunt Sade had packed for her earlier that morning. Jollof rice, stewed fish, soft plantains. It was supposed to be her lunch. Instead, she walked slowly toward the woman and knelt carefully beside the child. Please, Abibot said softly, handing over the flask. Let him eat first. The woman stared at her in shock. No, sister, this is your food. I can get more later. Tears instantly filled the stranger's eyes. The little boy grabbed the spoon hungrily while his mother kept whispering prayers beneath her breath. God will remember you, she said repeatedly. Abibot smiled faintly. Then something unexpected happened. As she watched the child eat, warmth spread quietly through her chest. Not excitement, not pride, purpose. For months her life had revolved around surviving pain. But in that small moment outside the hospital, she remembered something illness and heartbreak had almost stolen from her completely. She still had something valuable to give other people. That evening, she told Yetunde about the encounter while helping organize medication records at the nurses' station. And how did it make you feel? Yetunde asked. Abibot thought carefully. Useful. The nurse smiled immediately. There it is. There, what is the beginning of healing. Over the following weeks, Abibot started bringing small portions of homemade food whenever she visited the hospital. Nothing dramatic, Sometimes rice and beans for worried relatives sleeping beside sick loved ones. Sometimes warm soup for elderly patients with nobody visiting them. Sometimes bread and tea for mothers who skipped meals while caring for hospitalized children. At first she did it quietly, but kindness rarely stays invisible for long. People began recognizing her, the gentle woman with food, that patient who helps everybody. Even hospital staff noticed the difference her presence created in the ward atmosphere. One afternoon, Yetunde walked into the courtyard and found three elderly women laughing around Abibat while eating from plastic containers. "You have become famous," Yetunde teased. Abibat laughed softly. "It's only food." "No." Yetunde shook her head. "It's dignity." The sentence stayed with her deeply, because she understood hunger was rarely just about empty stomachs. Illness strips dignity from people slowly. Poverty humiliates quietly. Sometimes a warm meal given kindly can remind someone they still matter. Dr. Afolayan noticed the change too. One evening he sat beside Abibat beneath the mango tree after completing patient rounds. "I hear you're feeding half the hospital now," he joked. Abibat smiled shyly. "Only a few people." The doctor studied her carefully. "You know something interesting about suffering?" She looked at him curiously. "It either hardens people or deepens their compassion." Abibat lowered her eyes. "I don't want pain to turn me bitter." Dr. Afolayan nodded slowly. "Then you are already winning." A few days later, Yetunde approached her with an idea. "What if we organize meals properly?" the nurse suggested. "Not just randomly." Abibat frowned slightly. "How? There are many poor families here sleeping hungry every night while caring for relatives. Some patients stop responding to treatment because nutrition is terrible." Abibat listened carefully. Yetunde continued excitedly. "You know how to cook. Aunt Sadi can help. Some church women may volunteer." The idea frightened Abibat immediately. "That sounds too big." "Maybe. But maybe your life became painful for a reason bigger than survival." That night, Abibat could not stop thinking about the conversation. For so long, she had viewed herself only as someone abandoned, someone sick, someone broken. But now another possibility slowly emerged before her. What if her suffering had not ended her purpose? What if it had redirected it? The following week, with Yetunde's encouragement and Aunt Saad's support, Abibat started preparing simple, affordable meals from Aunt Saad's tiny kitchen. Rice, beans, vegetable soup, boiled yam. Nothing luxurious, but always warm, always respectful, always served with kindness. At first, they distributed only 15 meals daily around the hospital. Then 25, then 40. Soon local traders began donating ingredients occasionally after hearing about the effort. One woman contributed tomatoes, another offered cooking oil. A butcher provided discounted meat once a week. People trusted sincerity because sincerity carries a different energy than performance. Abibat worked carefully despite lingering physical weakness. Some mornings her body still ached badly. Some afternoons fatigue overwhelmed her completely. Yet strangely emotional strength kept growing inside her anyway. One evening, while stirring soup over the stove, Aunt Saad watched her quietly. "You smile more now," the older woman observed. Abibat paused slightly. "I forgot what smiling felt like. You are becoming yourself again." The words nearly made her cry, because for the first time in a very long while, she finally believed they might be true. Meanwhile, in Lagos, Olumide's world continued deteriorating quietly. The failed business deal created serious financial pressure inside his company. Investors became impatient. Rumors about internal instability spread across professional circles. At home, tension with Sarah worsened daily. They argued constantly now, about money, about appearances, about his emotional distance, about her spending habits. One night after another bitter argument, Olumide sat alone scrolling aimlessly through social media while trying to distract himself. Then suddenly, he froze. A familiar face appeared in a short online video posted by a local community blogger in Ibadan. Abibat. She stood beside large cooking pots beneath a small canopy near the hospital entrance while handing food containers to patients' families. She looked thinner than before, but alive, calm, gentle. The caption read, "Former patient now feeds struggling hospital families every week despite her own health battles. Humanity still exists." Olumide stared at the screen silently. In the video, a little girl hugged Abibat tightly after receiving food. Abibat smiled warmly and touched the child's hair with tenderness so natural it hurt to watch. For several seconds, Olumide forgot breathing, because the woman on his phone looked more beautiful than the glamorous model sleeping in his bedroom upstairs. Not physically. Something deeper. Peaceful. Real. Suddenly, Sarah's voice interrupted from the hallway. "What are you looking at?" Olumide locked the screen immediately. Nothing. But Sarah noticed the tension in his face instantly. "You're thinking about her again, aren't you?" He said nothing. Sarah crossed her arms angrily. "This obsession is becoming disrespectful." Olumide stood slowly. "She's not an obsession." "Then why do you look guilty every time her name appears?" Silence answered the question better than words. For the first time since their marriage began, Sarah looked genuinely threatened, because deep down she finally understood something dangerous. Olumide had not emotionally escaped his past, and no amount of beauty, luxury, or status could compete against the memory of a woman who once loved him with her entire soul. Back in Ibadan, Abibat finished serving meals late that evening and sat quietly outside the hospital beneath the darkening sky. Children laughed nearby while relatives thanked volunteers warmly. Her body was exhausted, but her heart felt strangely full. Yetunde sat beside her carrying 2 plastic cups of tea. "You know," the nurse smiled, "people are starting to call this place Mama Abibat's kitchen." Abibat laughed softly in disbelief. "Mama Abibat." "Yes. And honestly," Yetunde looked at her warmly, "it suits you." Abibat stared toward the crowded hospital entrance where frightened families continued arriving with loved ones. Not long ago, she believed her story had ended with betrayal. Now, slowly, painfully, beautifully, life was teaching her that broken hearts can still become places where other people find shelter. By the beginning of the rainy season, Mama Abibat's kitchen had become something far bigger than a few pots of food outside a hospital. People now traveled from nearby neighborhoods to help. Church women volunteered to chop vegetables before dawn. Motorcycle riders sometimes delivered meals for free. Market traders quietly set aside ingredients for Aunt Said whenever they could afford generosity. And somehow, despite still managing her illness carefully, Abibat kept showing up every morning with calm determination. She no longer looked like a woman waiting to die. She looked like someone rediscovering why she survived. One humid afternoon, heavy rain forced dozens of families to crowd beneath the hospital's narrow entrance canopy while waiting for treatment updates. Abibat and Yetunde hurried between people carrying steaming bowls of pepper soup and rice. "Careful, the floor is slippery," Yetunde warned while balancing containers. Nearby, a frightened teenage boy sat crying quietly beside his unconscious father. Abibat knelt beside him gently. "Have you eaten today?" The boy shook his head. "My father used all our money for transport." Without hesitation, Abibat handed him her own untouched meal container. "Start with this." The boy looked stunned. "You won't eat." She smiled softly. "I already have enough." A voice behind her suddenly interrupted. "No, you simply chose hunger for someone else." Abibat turned. An older man stood nearby beneath a black umbrella watching everything carefully. He wore simple but expensive traditional clothing, polished shoes, and the calm posture of someone deeply accustomed to authority. 2 younger men stood several feet behind him respectfully. Abibat immediately assumed he was another wealthy visitor. She lowered her eyes politely. "Good afternoon, sir." The man nodded. "I have been standing here nearly 20 minutes watching you serve people." Yetunde approached quietly and whispered to Abibat, "That is Chief Tunde Balogun." Abibat's eyes widened slightly. Everybody in southwestern Nigeria knew the name. Chief Tunde Balogun was one of the country's most respected businessmen, owner of major transportation companies, hotels, and agricultural investments. But beyond wealth, he was known for something rare among powerful men. He quietly funded hospitals, orphanages, and scholarship programs without chasing publicity. The chief studied Abibat carefully. "You are the woman people call Mama Abibat." She looked embarrassed immediately. It's only a nickname. Sometimes nicknames reveal character better than titles. His answer carried warmth, not arrogance. Chief Tunde glanced around the overcrowded hospital entrance again. How long have you been doing this work? Several months. And who funds it? Abibot hesitated. God and kind people. The chief smiled faintly at that answer. Later that evening, after the rain eased, Yetunde nearly exploded with excitement. Do you understand who that man is? Abibot laughed softly. Yes, I know. No, you don't know. Men like Chief Tunde rarely stop for ordinary charity work unless something truly touches them. Abibot shrugged gently. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. That is probably why he noticed you. 3 days later, a black luxury SUV stopped outside Aunt Said's modest home shortly after sunrise. Neighbors immediately peeked through windows. Children gathered near the gate, whispering excitedly. A sharply dressed assistant stepped out carrying an umbrella before opening the back door respectfully. Then Chief Tunde himself emerged. Aunt Sade nearly dropped the bowl she was washing. Important people have found our street today. Abibot quickly wiped her hands on her wrapper before greeting him nervously. Sir, welcome. The chief looked around the modest compound quietly. No performance, no hidden cameras, no attempts to impress him. Just simplicity. I hope I am not disturbing you, he said. Not at all. He accepted the plastic chair Aunt Saad offered and sat beneath the small veranda while rainwater dripped softly from the roof edges. For several moments, he simply watched Abibot carefully. Finally, he spoke. I asked people questions about you after leaving the hospital. Abibot looked uncomfortable immediately. You didn't need to do that. I know. He smiled slightly, but I wanted to understand why a woman recovering from serious illness spends her strength feeding strangers. Abibot lowered her eyes. Because I know what helplessness feels like. The honesty in her answer silenced the small space between them. Chief Tunde leaned back thoughtfully. Most people who suffer become consumed with themselves. I almost did too, she admitted quietly. What changed? Abibot glanced toward the neighborhood children playing near the muddy roadside. Pain feels smaller when somebody else stops hurting because of you. For several seconds, Chief Tunde said nothing. Then slowly, he nodded. I would like to help you. Abibot immediately shook her head. Sir, we are managing. That is exactly why I trust you. He reached inside his agbada and handed her a small folder. Inside were documents, rental agreements, equipment estimates, kitchen supply contracts. Abibot frowned in confusion. Chief Tunde explained calmly. There is an unused property near the hospital, large enough for a proper community kitchen and recovery meal program. Abibot stared at him speechlessly. You want to give me a building I want to invest in integrity before this country forgets what integrity looks like? Tears gathered slowly in her eyes. Sir, I cannot repay this. Chief Tunde's expression softened. My daughter died 11 years ago. The word surprised everyone. He continued quietly. She suffered kidney complications while studying abroad. Money could not save her. He paused briefly. Since then, I have met many successful people, very few compassionate ones. Abibot's throat tightened painfully. For the first time, she noticed grief hidden behind the powerful businessman's calm face. You remind me of something this country desperately needs, he said gently. Human beings who still care. That afternoon changed everything. Within weeks, construction and renovations began on the small community kitchen facility. Volunteers multiplied. Local businesses donated supplies after hearing Chief Tunde supported the project. And slowly, Mama Abibot's kitchen transformed into something larger than survival meals. It became a place where struggling families felt seen. Meanwhile, in Lagos, Olumide's life continued unraveling. His company faced growing financial pressure after another major investor withdrew unexpectedly. Rumors spread through business circles that management instability threatened future projects. At home, things with Sarah became unbearable. One evening, Olumide returned exhausted from a disastrous board meeting, only to find Sarah hosting influencers and photographers inside their apartment without informing him. Music blasted loudly. Champagne bottles covered the dining table. One influencer laughed while recording videos near expensive artwork. Olumide stared in disbelief. What is this? Sarah rolled her eyes dramatically. A brand dinner. In my house, our house. You invited strangers while I'm dealing with serious company problems. Sarah folded her arms immediately. There you go again. Always bringing negative energy home, Olumide laughed bitterly. Negative energy? My company may collapse, and screaming won't fix it. He stared at her silently. Then suddenly he remembered nights when Abibat sat awake massaging his shoulders after stressful meetings, despite her own pain. She had carried his burdens emotionally. Sarah only measured how those burdens affected her comfort. The realization crushed him. Later that night, after guests finally left, Olumide sat alone scrolling through news updates on his phone. Then another article appeared. This time featuring photographs of Mama Abibat's kitchen's official opening ceremony beside Chief Tunde Balogun. In the pictures, Abibat stood smiling modestly beside volunteers and recovering patients. She looked healthy, peaceful, respected, alive in a way he had not seen for years. Olumide zoomed in on her face slowly, and suddenly something inside him broke completely, because the woman he abandoned during sickness had somehow rebuilt herself into someone brighter without him, while he, despite wealth and status, felt emptier every single day. Across the city inside her new community kitchen, Abibat finished evening prayers quietly after volunteers departed. The building smelled warmly of cooked rice and spices. Outside families laughed softly while collecting leftover food containers. Abibat stood alone for a moment beneath the kitchen lights. Months ago she believed betrayal had ended her life. Now she understood something different. Sometimes God removes people not to destroy your future, but to force you toward the purpose your pain was hiding from you all along. The scandal that destroyed Olumide Bello's second marriage began with a missing signature. It was a Thursday afternoon inside the glass conference room of Bello Urban Developments. Senior executives sat around the long polished table while tension spread heavily through the air. A foreign investor had suddenly frozen millions of naira connected to one of the company's largest housing projects. Nobody understood why. We submitted every required document, one director argued nervously. Another executive shook his head. No. The authorization transfer is missing approval clearance. Olumide frowned immediately. That's impossible. But 20 minutes later, after reviewing internal records, the impossible became terrifyingly real. Large amounts of company money had been moved quietly over several months into luxury accounts connected to entertainment and branding agencies, fashion agencies, luxury travel companies, designer boutiques. The room fell silent. One board member looked directly at Olumide. Sir, these transactions were approved through your executive access. Olumide's stomach tightened, because he already knew who had access to those accounts besides him. Sarah. After the meeting ended disastrously, Olumide drove home through Lagos traffic with shaking hands gripping the steering wheel. For months he had ignored warning signs, the reckless spending, the constant demands, the pressure to maintain appearances no matter what financial strain existed underneath. But now reality stood directly in front of him, and reality looked expensive. When he entered the apartment, music played loudly upstairs while servants arranged shopping bags across the living room floor. Sarah appeared moments later wearing designer sunglasses despite being indoors. You're home early? She said casually. Olumide threw printed bank statements onto the table. What is this? Sarah removed her glasses slowly. What are you talking about? These transfers. She glanced briefly at the papers without concern. Oh, that. Olumide stared at her in disbelief. That. You said I could use the company lifestyle account for reasonable expenses? She crossed her arms immediately. Don't start shouting at me because your business is failing. His voice rose sharply. You spent company money without approval. I spent money maintaining the image your company benefits from. Olumide laughed bitterly. Image. Yes, image. Do you think investors care about struggling-looking wives? Public appearance matters? The sentence hit him painfully because it sounded disturbingly familiar. That same poisonous obsession with appearances had helped destroy his first marriage, but now he finally heard how ugly it truly sounded. You lied to me, he said quietly. Sarah rolled her eyes. Oh, please, Olumide, stop acting innocent. You left your sick wife because you wanted a glamorous life. Now suddenly you want to behave morally. The cruelty of her honesty stunned him. For several seconds neither spoke. Then Sarah delivered the final blow. I never forced you to abandon Abibat. You did that yourself. Silence crashed heavily between them, because despite everything she was right. Olumide's breathing became uneven. Months ago he blamed pressure, stress, and unhappiness for his choices. But standing there now, he could no longer escape the truth. Nobody forced him to betray loyalty. Nobody forced him to abandon a sick woman who once sacrificed everything for him. He chose it. And now the consequences had finally arrived. Meanwhile, in Ibadan, Abibat's life continued growing quietly in ways she never imagined possible. Mama Abibat's kitchen now served over 200 meals weekly. Volunteers came regularly. Local newspapers occasionally mentioned the project. Families recovering from medical crises often returned later just to say thank you. But despite growing recognition, Abibot remained simple. Every morning, she still helped wash vegetables herself. She still greeted patients personally. And every evening, she still thanked volunteers one by one before closing. One Saturday afternoon, Dr. Afolayan visited the kitchen unexpectedly. He stood watching Abibot organize meal containers while children laughed nearby. You look stronger, he observed. Abibot smiled warmly. I feel stronger, and your latest results confirm it. She froze slightly. What results? The doctor adjusted his glasses calmly. Your kidney function has improved significantly. Tears instantly gathered in her eyes. Months earlier, she could barely stand without collapsing. Now her body was finally responding positively, not perfectly, not magically, but truly healing. Dr. Afolayan lowered his voice gently. Peace can heal parts of the body medicine alone cannot reach. Abibot understood exactly what he meant. Back in Lagos, peace had disappeared from Olumide's life completely. Within days, rumors about financial instability spread publicly through business circles. Investors questioned leadership decisions. Social media bloggers began discussing luxury overspending scandals connected to high-profile executives and celebrity wives. Then came the humiliation that shattered everything permanently. A popular entertainment blog published photographs of Sarah entering a luxury hotel repeatedly with a wealthy musician named Damola King. At first, Olumide refused believing it, until videos appeared, clear videos, laughing together, holding hands, entering private suites. The internet exploded instantly. Comment sections mocked him brutally. So the model used him and moved on. Karma for abandoning his sick wife. Money cannot buy loyalty. For the first time in his adult life, Olumide experienced public humiliation powerful enough to destroy pride completely. That evening, he confronted Sarah directly. Tell me the truth. She sat calmly on the sofa, scrolling through her phone. You already saw the videos. How long? Sarah sighed dramatically. Why does it matter now? Olumide stared at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time. You embarrassed me publicly. Her eyes hardened immediately. And what exactly did you do to Abibot? The question silenced him instantly. Sarah stood slowly. You think you're the victim because another person finally treated you selfishly? She asked coldly. Welcome to reality. Olumide's voice trembled with anger. I destroyed my marriage for you. No. Sarah grabbed her handbag. You destroyed your marriage because you were weak. Then she walked toward the door. Where are you going? She paused briefly before answering without emotion. Somewhere peaceful. The door slammed behind her. And just like that, Olumide Bello found himself completely alone. The silence inside the apartment felt unbearable. No music, no glamour, no admiration, only emptiness. Hours later, near midnight, Olumide sat drinking quietly in darkness while rain fell against the windows. Then his phone buzzed. A new article notification appeared. Mama Abibot's kitchen expands support for recovering patients. He stared at the headline for a long moment before opening it. Inside were photographs of Abibot smiling beside volunteers and children. She looked healthy now, not fully healed, but alive with purpose. The article described her kindness, resilience, and dedication to helping vulnerable families despite surviving serious illness and personal hardship. One sentence nearly stopped his breathing. Many people describe Abibat Bello as proof that suffering does not have to destroy compassion. Olumide closed his eyes painfully, because he suddenly understood the terrible difference between them. Abibat suffered and became softer. He succeeded and became crueler. Real tears finally rolled down his face then. Not because Sarah betrayed him, not because his business struggled, but because he finally saw clearly what kind of man he had become. And for the first time since abandoning Abibat, he hated himself for it. The invitation arrived on a quiet Monday morning inside a cream-colored envelope sealed with gold lettering. Abibat almost ignored it. She was standing beside large cooking pots in Mama Abibat's kitchen when one of the volunteers handed it to her carefully. "A driver brought this," the woman said. "From Lagos." Abibat wiped her hands on her apron before opening the envelope slowly. Inside was a formal invitation to the annual Hope for Healing Charity Gala, one of the most respected fundraising events supporting hospitals and low-income patients across Nigeria. At the bottom of the letter, a handwritten note appeared. "Your work deserves to be seen. Chief Tunde Balogun." Abibat stared at the words silently. Yetunde, standing nearby, nearly shouted with excitement. "Do you understand what this means?" Abibat laughed nervously. "It means rich people are gathering to eat expensive food while talking about charity." No, Yetunde grabbed the invitation dramatically. "It means your work is finally reaching important people." Abibat became quiet again. The truth was, she still felt uncomfortable around wealthy spaces. Too many painful memories lived there. Luxury hotels reminded her of Olumide and Sarah's wedding photographs. Elegant events reminded her how easily people admired appearances while ignoring suffering. Chief Tunde visited later that afternoon and immediately noticed her hesitation. "You don't want to attend?" he observed calmly. Abibat lowered her eyes. "I am not the kind of person who belongs at those events." The older man smiled gently. "My daughter, kindness, belongs everywhere." She said nothing. Chief Tunde sat beside her near the kitchen entrance while volunteers packed meal containers nearby. "When my daughter was alive," he said quietly, "she once told me something important." He paused briefly. "She said powerful rooms remain dangerous when good people avoid entering them." Abibat listened carefully. "You are helping people survive," he continued. "Never think your story is smaller than wealth." Those words stayed with her for days. Meanwhile, in Lagos, Olumide's life continued collapsing publicly. The scandal involving Sarah and the musician damaged his reputation severely. Investors distanced themselves. Business partners avoided association. Even relatives who once admired his glamorous marriage now whispered about karma behind closed doors. Worst of all, loneliness filled every part of his life. Sarah had moved out completely. The apartment felt hollow now, cold. Every room carried expensive furniture, but no peace. One evening, Olumide sat alone scrolling through old photographs on his phone. Not pictures of luxury trips or celebrity events. Pictures of Abibat. Abibat laughing while burning plantains. Abibat sleeping beside him on their old apartment couch during power outages. Abibat smiling proudly the day he received his first major promotion. His chest tightened painfully. How had he abandoned someone who loved him like that? A sudden knock interrupted his thoughts. His older sister, Moranique, entered carrying groceries. The moment she saw the state of the apartment, her expression changed. "You haven't eaten properly, have you?" "I'm fine. You look terrible." Olumide laughed bitterly. "That makes two of us." Moranique sat carefully across from him. For several moments, silence filled the room before she finally spoke. "I saw an article about Abibat." Olumide's face tightened instantly. "She's doing good work." He looked away. "Yes." Moranique hesitated before continuing. "I was cruel to her." Olumide stared at his sister in surprise. "I said terrible things after the divorce." Tears gathered in her eyes slowly. "I thought sickness made her weak. But now—" She shook her head sadly. "She became stronger than all of us." Her words hurt because they were true. That same week in Ibadan, volunteers helped prepare new clothing for Abibat before the gala. Nothing extravagant. A simple, elegant navy blue gown chosen carefully by Yetunde and Aunt Said. When Abibat first tried it on, she stared at herself quietly inside the small mirror. For years, illness and heartbreak had changed how she viewed herself. She no longer saw beauty easily. Yet the woman staring back at her now looked different, still soft, still gentle, but stronger somehow. Aunt Saad smiled proudly behind her. See, your light is returning. Abibat touched the fabric nervously. I haven't attended a formal event in years. Yetunde laughed. Then Lagos will survive one evening seeing real grace again. The night of the gala arrived warm and bright. Luxury cars lined the entrance of the Grand Lagos Hotel, while photographers captured politicians, celebrities, doctors, and wealthy donors entering beneath golden lights. Abibat stepped carefully from Chief Tunde's vehicle, her heart beating hard against her chest. For a brief moment, fear almost overwhelmed her. Memories flooded back instantly. Another ballroom, another elegant event, humiliation, abandonment, pain. Then Chief Tunde gently offered his arm. You are not arriving here as someone abandoned anymore, he said quietly. You are arriving as someone respected. Abibot inhaled slowly. Then she walked forward. Inside the ballroom, conversation softened almost immediately as people recognized her. Some guests whispered, That's Mama Abibat, the woman from the hospital kitchens. I heard she survived serious illness herself. But unlike the judgmental whispers she once endured beside Olumide, these carried admiration instead of mockery. Abibot moved through the room nervously, greeting guests politely, while Yetunde smiled proudly nearby. Then suddenly, across the ballroom entrance, Olumide arrived. The moment he saw her, he stopped walking completely. Everything around him blurred. Music, voices, lights. All of it disappeared beneath the shock crashing through his chest. Abibot stood near Chief Tunde, wearing the deep blue gown, smiling softly while speaking to a group of doctors. She looked healthy, peaceful, beautiful in a way no expensive glamour could imitate. For several seconds, Olumide could barely breathe, because the woman he abandoned looked more radiant than she ever had during their marriage. Not because of makeup or wealth, because suffering had refined her instead of destroying her. Nearby guests noticed his reaction immediately. One businessman leaned toward another and whispered quietly, That's her ex-husband. Olumide heard the words but could not move. Then Abibot finally turned and saw him too. Silence settled inside her instantly. For one suspended moment, both simply stared at each other across the crowded ballroom. Olumide looked thinner now, older. The confidence that once surrounded him had faded into visible exhaustion. Abibot expected anger to rise inside her, or bitterness, or revenge. Instead, she simply felt sad. Sad for what they once were. Sad for the choices that destroyed them. Sad because the man standing across the room looked deeply lost. Chief Tunde noticed everything immediately. You know him? One guest asked quietly. Abibot answered calmly. Yes. She did not explain further. On stage, the event host soon began introducing honored guests and community initiatives. Then unexpectedly, the host smiled toward Abibot. And tonight we also recognize one woman whose compassion transformed suffering into hope for hundreds of vulnerable families. Applause filled the ballroom. Abibot froze in surprise. Please welcome Mama Abibat Bello. The entire room turned toward her. And across the ballroom, Olumide watched in stunned silence as the woman he once treated like a burden slowly walked toward the stage, while powerful people rose to their feet applauding her with genuine respect. The applause inside the ballroom lasted far longer than Abibot expected. She stood beneath the warm stage lights, holding the award plaque carefully while cameras flashed across the crowd. Her hands trembled slightly, not from sickness this time, but from emotion. Just 1 year earlier, she had been lying weak and abandoned inside a crowded hospital ward, wondering if her life still mattered. Now an entire room full of respected people stood applauding her kindness. The contrast felt almost unreal. Would you like to say a few words? The host asked warmly. Abibot hesitated. Public speaking had never been natural for her, but as she looked across the ballroom, she saw faces filled with genuine attention, not pity, not mockery, not judgment. So she stepped closer to the microphone quietly. I don't really know how to give big speeches, she began softly. Gentle laughter moved through the audience. Abibot smiled faintly before continuing. I only know what suffering feels like. The room became still. There was a time in my life when I believed pain had destroyed everything I was. I became very sick. I lost my marriage. I lost my home. And for many months, her voice trembled slightly. I believed I had also lost my value as a human being. Across the ballroom, Olumide lowered his eyes. Every sentence felt personal, because it was. Abibat continued carefully. But while recovering in the hospital, I discovered something important. Sometimes people who are hurting deeply can still become places of comfort for others. Several guests wiped tears quietly. Abibat glanced toward Yatunde and Aunt Saad sitting nearby. These people helped me survive. And when someone helps you survive, you should never waste your second chance only feeling sorry for yourself. The applause returned softly. Then she finished with the words that pierced Olumide's heart most deeply. Pain can either make us cruel or compassionate. Every day we choose which kind of person suffering will create. Silence followed. Heavy, beautiful, truthful. Then the entire ballroom rose again in applause. Olumide could not clap. His chest hurt too badly. Because the woman he once abandoned in weakness now stood teaching powerful people about humanity. And he realized something devastating. Abibat had become stronger after losing him, while he had become smaller after betraying her. Later that evening, after the formal presentations ended, guests surrounded Abibat warmly. Doctors praised her work. Business leaders offered support. Community organizers requested partnerships. For the first time in years, Abibat moved through a wealthy environment without feeling invisible or ashamed. But beneath all the conversation, she remained aware of one thing constantly. Olumide was still there, watching. Several times she caught glimpses of him standing alone near the edges of the ballroom while others socialized around him politely but distantly. His reputation had clearly suffered. The confident businessman who once dominated rooms now looked like a man uncertain whether he deserved entering them. Eventually, while Yetunde spoke with hospital donors nearby, Abibat stepped briefly onto the outdoor terrace for air. Cool Lagos wind moved softly across the city lights below. For several peaceful seconds, she stood alone. Then she heard footsteps behind her. She already knew who it was before turning around. Olumide stopped several feet away. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them carried years of memories, love, betrayal, suffering, regret. Finally, Olumide spoke quietly. "You look healthy." Abibot nodded gently. "I'm improving." His eyes studied her face carefully, not searching for beauty, searching for forgiveness. "You did all this?" he asked softly. "The kitchen." "Yes, with help." Olumide swallowed hard. "I saw articles online. I didn't realize," his voice faded, "that I survived." The honesty of the question hit him painfully. "I heard you were recovering," he said weakly. Abibot looked out toward the city lights again. "There was a period doctors thought my kidneys might fail completely." Olumide froze. "What?" She remained calm while speaking, which somehow made the words hurt worse. "The stress after the divorce worsened my condition badly. I collapsed during the trip to Ibadan." His face lost color slowly. "Nobody told me." Abibot gave a small, sad smile. "You were busy getting married." The sentence shattered him quietly. For months he convinced himself he had left before things became truly dangerous. Now he understood the truth. Abibot nearly died after he abandoned her. And while she fought for survival, he stood beneath chandeliers exchanging vows with another woman. Olumide's eyes filled instantly. "I didn't know," he whispered. Abibot finally looked directly at him. "But you also didn't ask." Those words destroyed the last defense protecting his conscience. Because she was right. After the divorce, he buried himself in luxury, distraction, and excitement, instead of checking whether the woman who once sacrificed everything for him was even alive. Tears rolled slowly down his face. Real tears. Not dramatic, not performative. The helpless tears of a man finally forced to face the full weight of his cruelty. "I'm sorry," he whispered brokenly. Abibot's expression softened slightly, but not romantically, compassionately. There was a difference now. "You know what hurt most?" she asked quietly. Olumide lowered his eyes. "What? You stopped seeing me as human the moment I became inconvenient." Her words entered him like fire. I was scared, he admitted weakly. Everything became heavy, the sickness, the pressure. And instead of carrying the weight with me, Abibat said softly, "You ran toward comfort." He nodded painfully, because there was no defense left anymore. The truth stood naked between them now. Olumide wiped his face shakily. I destroyed everything. For several moments, only wind and distant traffic filled the silence. Then Abibat spoke words he never expected. I forgave you a long time ago. He looked at her in shock. What forgiveness was necessary for my healing? Olumide stared at her speechlessly. How can you forgive me after what I did? Abibat's eyes became distant briefly. Because bitterness was making me sick too. The answer humbled him completely. Inside the ballroom behind them, music and conversation continued softly, while powerful guests celebrated hope and charity. But out on the terrace, something far more important was happening. A broken man was finally seeing the true cost of his choices. Olumide looked at Abibat carefully. She no longer belonged emotionally to his past. That realization terrified him, not because another man had taken his place, because purpose had, peace had, healing had. The woman standing before him no longer needed his validation to understand her worth. I miss you every day, he confessed quietly. Abibat closed her eyes briefly. Those words once would have shattered her. Now they simply made her sad. Sometimes she answered gently, people only understand the value of water after destroying the well. Olumide began crying harder. Not loudly, just silently, broken. Because deep inside he finally understood something irreversible. He had abandoned the only person who ever truly loved him without conditions. And now that same woman stood before him, stronger, respected, and emotionally free from the man who once made her feel worthless. A voice interrupted softly behind them. Madam Abibat, the organizers are looking for you. It was Yatunde. Abibat nodded politely. I'm coming. Before leaving, she turned toward Olumide one final time. I truly hope you heal too, she said quietly. Then she walked away. Olumide remained alone on the terrace, watching her disappear back into the ballroom lights. And for the first time in his life, success, beauty, wealth, and status all felt completely meaningless compared to the quiet love he had once held in his hands and thrown away. After the charity gala, news about Abibat spread across Nigeria faster than anyone expected. Television stations invited her for interviews. Blogs shared her story. New donors contacted Mama Abibat's kitchen offering support and partnerships. But while the public celebrated her resilience, Abibat herself remained unchanged in the ways that mattered most. She still woke before sunrise, still helped prepare food herself, still sat beside frightened patients in overcrowded hospital corridors. Pain had humbled her too deeply to let fame change her heart. Meanwhile, Olumide's world continued collapsing publicly. Within 2 weeks of the gala, his company lost another major contract. Investors no longer trusted his leadership after months of scandal and instability. Several senior staff resigned quietly. Newspapers that once praised him now described him as a businessman struggling through personal controversy. For the first time since becoming wealthy, Olumide experienced what failure truly felt like. And this time nobody stood beside him. Not Sarah, not ambitious friends, not the social circles that once surrounded him constantly. Success had attracted many people. Suffering revealed how few truly cared. One rainy afternoon, Olumide sat alone inside his nearly empty office, staring at old financial reports without reading them. His phone buzzed repeatedly with missed calls from creditors and business partners. He ignored all of them. Then, unexpectedly, another notification appeared. A live television interview featuring Abibat. For several seconds, he hesitated. Then he opened it. The interviewer smiled warmly on screen. Many people call you an inspiration now. After everything you survived, do you ever regret the painful experiences that shaped you? Abibat became quiet before answering. Yes, she admitted honestly. Some pain changes you forever. Olumide lowered his eyes immediately, but she continued softly. I also learned something important. Broken seasons can either bury people or grow compassion inside them. The interviewer nodded carefully. And what would you say to someone who betrayed or abandoned you during your hardest moments? Olumide's chest tightened. Millions of viewers across the country waited for her answer. Abibat smiled sadly. I would say hurting people usually carry brokenness too. Sometimes people destroy love because they are too emotionally weak to carry responsibility. Olumide covered his mouth with trembling fingers, because she was describing him perfectly. But forgiveness matters, Abibat continued quietly. Not because betrayal is acceptable, but because bitterness keeps wounded people emotionally chained to the people who hurt them. By the time the interview ended, Olumide was crying openly in his office, not only from guilt anymore, from shame, because despite all the pain he caused her, Abibat still spoke with grace while he had become bitter, lonely, and emotionally lost. That evening, after hours of silent torment, Olumide made a decision. He drove to Ibadan. The rain fell heavily across the highway while old memories flooded his mind relentlessly. Abibat selling her earrings. Abibat waiting awake with food late at night. Abibat trembling while signing divorce papers. Every memory now looked different through guilt. By the time he arrived at Mama Abibat's kitchen, evening prayers had just ended. Families slowly collected meal containers while volunteers cleaned tables nearby. The moment Yatund saw Olumide stepping from his car, her expression hardened instantly. What are you doing here? Olumide looked exhausted. I need to speak with Abibat. Yatunde crossed her arms. You lost that right. I know. His voice cracked slightly. Please. Before Yatunde could answer, Abibat appeared near the kitchen doorway, wearing a simple headscarf and apron. She froze briefly after seeing him. Volunteers nearby became silent immediately. Everyone recognized the tension. Olumide stepped forward slowly. Can we talk? For several seconds, Abibat simply studied his face. He looked thinner now, defeated, like a man carrying invisible weight too heavy for pride to hide anymore. Finally, she nodded gently. They walked quietly toward the small courtyard behind the kitchen while rain dripped softly from nearby rooftops. Neither spoke at first. Then suddenly Olumide fell to his knees. Abibat gasped softly in shock. I destroyed everything, he whispered brokenly. I destroyed our marriage. I destroyed your trust. I abandoned you when you needed me most. Rain soaked his clothes while tears streamed openly down his face. Several volunteers watching from a distance looked stunned, because powerful men rarely kneel publicly, especially not men like Olumide Bello. I thought success meant escaping struggle, he continued painfully, but all I really did was abandon the best person in my life. Abibat's eyes filled slowly with tears too, not because she wanted him back, because seeing genuine regret always hurts differently than seeing cruelty. Olumide lowered his head completely. I know I don't deserve forgiveness. You already have forgiveness, Abibat answered softly. He looked up slowly. Then why does it still hurt this much? Her voice became gentle. Because forgiveness does not erase consequences. The sentence settled heavily between them. Olumide cried harder. I wake up every day thinking about how alone you must have felt. Abibot swallowed painfully. I was very alone. The honesty of her answer shattered him further. I nearly died after you left, she continued quietly. Not only physically, emotionally too. Olumide covered his face in shame, but eventually she said softly, I realized something important. He looked at her weakly. You leaving forced me to find myself outside being someone's wife. Rain continued falling around them while silence stretched gently between both wounded hearts. Olumide finally whispered the question living inside him since the gala. Is there any chance at all, that we could start again? Abibot closed her eyes briefly. That question once would have meant everything to her. Now it only revealed how much she had changed. When she finally spoke, her voice carried no anger, only truth. No. Olumide looked as if the word physically struck him. Abibot knelt slowly so they stood at eye level beneath the rain. I loved you deeply, she said softly. Part of me probably always will in some way, but love without safety becomes suffering. Tears rolled down Olumide's face again. I changed. Yes, she answered gently, but the version of me that needed your love almost died waiting for it. Silence followed. Then Abibot placed one hand softly against his shoulder. I do not hate you, Olumide. That kindness hurt him more than punishment ever could. Then why can't we try again? Because healing also means refusing to return to places that destroyed you. The words ended the fantasy completely. For the first time, Olumide truly understood. Forgiveness did not guarantee restoration. Some losses remain permanent precisely because they teach necessary lessons. Nearby Yetunde quietly wiped tears while watching from the kitchen doorway. Even Chief Tunde, who had arrived moments earlier during the rain, remained silently moved by the painful honesty unfolding before him. Olumide slowly stood again. The powerful businessman who once abandoned a sick woman now looked small beside her quiet strength. I am proud of you, he whispered brokenly. Abibot smiled sadly. I wish you had been proud before I became useful to the world. That sentence pierced deeper than anything else she had said, because it exposed the ugliest truth of all. He only fully recognized her value after other people started celebrating it. Olumide nodded slowly through tears. You deserved better than me. Abibot looked toward the busy kitchen where volunteers continued feeding struggling families despite the rain. No, she answered softly. I deserved someone emotionally strong enough to love me during suffering. Then she stepped backward gently, not cruelly, not angrily, just firmly. And in that moment, Olumide finally understood the full cost of betrayal. Sometimes the greatest punishment is not losing success, not public shame, not loneliness. It is watching the person you once abandoned become everything beautiful, without needing you anymore. 1 year later, Mama Abibot's kitchen had grown into something nobody in Ibadan could ignore. What began as a few shared meals outside a hospital had become a full community support center, serving recovering patients, struggling widows, abandoned elderly people, and hungry children from nearby neighborhoods. The building itself remained simple. Painted cream walls, plastic chairs, large cooking pots steaming from sunrise until evening. But inside those walls lived something many wealthy institutions lacked completely. Human warmth. Every morning before dawn, volunteers gathered laughing softly while preparing rice, soup, bread, and tea. Nurses from nearby clinics often stopped by after long shifts just to rest briefly in the peaceful atmosphere. And at the center of everything stood Abibat, not as a celebrity, not as a victim, but as a woman who survived enough pain to recognize suffering in other people's eyes immediately. Her health was not perfect. Some days, exhaustion still returned unexpectedly. Dr. Afolayan continued monitoring her, carefully reminding her not to overwork herself. But she was alive, strong, emotionally free. One bright Saturday morning, children chased each other across the courtyard while Abibot supervised food distribution near the entrance. A little girl suddenly hugged her waist tightly. Mama Abibat. The child smiled. When I grow up, I want to help people too. Abibot laughed softly and touched her cheek gently. Then start by being kind now. Nearby Yetunde watched the scene with emotional eyes. You know, she whispered to Aunt Sade, she saved herself while saving other people. Aunt Sade nodded proudly. Yes, God rebuilt her heart through service. Meanwhile, in Lagos, Olumide's life had changed completely. His company survived financially, but barely. Several luxury properties were sold to repay debts. Most of the powerful social circles that once surrounded him disappeared after scandal destroyed his reputation. Sarah had officially moved abroad with the musician she left him for. Occasionally, gossip blogs still mentioned her glamorous lifestyle online, but Olumide no longer paid attention. For the first time in many years, he lived quietly, alone, without pretending. The expensive apartment felt empty now, so he eventually moved into a smaller place near Surulere, where life felt less artificial. And every single day he carried regret. Not dramatic regret, not self-pity. The deep, permanent regret of a man who finally understood too late what loyalty truly looks like. Sometimes at night he still remembered Abibot sitting beside him during their struggling years, smiling despite hardship. Those memories no longer tortured him angrily. They humbled him. One afternoon, Olumide visited his mother quietly after several weeks away. The elderly woman studied him carefully while serving tea. You look more peaceful, she observed. Olumide gave a tired smile. I stopped chasing appearances. His mother nodded slowly. Then, after a long silence, she asked softly, "Have you forgiven yourself yet?" The question caught him off guard. Olumide stared down at his cup. "I don't know if I deserve to." His mother touched his hand gently. Real repentance is not only crying over mistakes, it is becoming someone who would never repeat them. Those words stayed with him deeply. Back in Ibadan, Chief Tunde visited Mama Abibat's kitchen carrying important news. They sat together beneath the veranda while volunteers organized donations nearby. "There is an opportunity," he explained carefully. "Several hospitals in other states want to partner with your program." Abibat looked overwhelmed immediately. "Other states?" "Yes. They heard about your recovery meal model." Abibot laughed nervously. "I'm still learning myself." Chief Tunde smiled warmly. "The best leaders are usually people humble enough to keep learning." She became quiet. A year ago, she could barely stand without collapsing emotionally or physically. Now respected people sought her guidance. Life truly changes in ways nobody predicts. That evening, after most volunteers left, Abibot sat alone briefly in the courtyard watching sunset colors spread across the sky. Then she noticed someone approaching the gate quietly. Olumide. He looked hesitant, almost unsure whether he should continue walking closer. Abibot stood slowly. Unlike before, there was no painful shock in seeing him now, only calm. Olumide stopped several feet away respectfully. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "You're not." He nodded toward the busy kitchen. "It keeps growing. People helped." He smiled faintly. "You always say that." Abibot smiled softly too, because humility had become natural to her now. For several moments they simply stood together peacefully. Then Olumide reached into his pocket and handed her a folded envelope. "What is this, a donation agreement?" he explained quietly. "I sold another property recently. Part of the money belongs here." Abibot looked surprised immediately. "You don't owe me money." "I know." He swallowed carefully. "But I owe the world better behavior than I gave before." The honesty in his voice touched her. She accepted the envelope slowly. "Thank you." Olumide looked around the courtyard again. Children laughed nearby while volunteers packed leftover food containers for elderly patients. "You built something beautiful," he whispered. Abibot glanced around thoughtfully. "No, pain built it. I just chose not to let pain make me cruel." Olumide lowered his eyes because those words perfectly summarized the difference between them. Both suffered, but suffering transformed them differently. After a long silence, Olumide spoke again. "I started volunteering recently." Abibot looked genuinely surprised. "At a rehabilitation center in Lagos," he explained awkwardly. "Mostly helping men recovering from addiction and depression." A small smile touched her lips. "That's good. I think—" He paused carefully. "I think I spent too many years believing success made me valuable. Losing everything forced me to become human again." Abibot felt tears gather unexpectedly, not from romance, from healing, because the broken man standing before her now finally resembled the humble young Olumide she once loved long ago. Not fully, but honestly. And honesty mattered. "You know," Olumide said quietly, "meeting you again after all this pain was probably the greatest mercy God gave me." Abibot's eyes softened. "Why?" "Because watching you survive without hatred forced me to face myself truthfully." Silence settled gently between them. Then Abibot spoke words neither of them expected. "I'm glad you survived too." Olumide looked at her in surprise. She smiled sadly. "Not every person who destroys love learns from it. Some only become more bitter." A small laugh escaped him. "I almost did. But you didn't." For the first time in a very long while, peace existed between them without expectation. No fantasy of returning, no desperate attempts to rewrite the past, just two wounded people who finally understood what suffering had taught them. As evening deepened, Yetunde called from the kitchen doorway. "Mama Abibat." "The children are waiting for evening prayers." Abibot laughed softly. "I'm coming." She looked back at Olumide one final time. "Take care of yourself." "You too." Then she walked toward the glowing kitchen lights where children, volunteers, and recovering families waited warmly for her return. Olumide remained standing quietly near the gate, watching her disappear into the life she rebuilt from pain. And though regret would always remain part of him, another truth finally existed beside it now. The woman he once abandoned did not become bitter. She became light for other people. And perhaps that was the greatest justice of all. After everything Abibat survived, one truth became impossible to ignore. Real love is not tested during celebration. It is tested during suffering. Many people stay close when life feels beautiful, successful, and easy. But true character appears when sickness enters the room, when money disappears, when dreams collapse, and when loyalty suddenly becomes inconvenient. Olumide lost the woman who loved him most because he confused appearance with happiness. He chased comfort instead of commitment. And by the time he understood the value of genuine love, the woman he abandoned had already learned how to live without him. But this story is not only about betrayal. It is also about healing. Because Abibot refused to let pain turn her heart cruel. Instead of becoming bitter, she became compassionate. Instead of destroying herself with hatred, she transformed suffering into shelter for others. And sometimes that is the greatest victory life can offer. If this story touched your heart, tell us in the comments. What lesson stayed with you the most? And if you still believe kindness, loyalty, and compassion matter in this world, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who may need hope today. Your support helps us continue telling stories that heal hearts around the world.